I just switch off my mute my phone.
Sundar, can you mute all the mic except the speaker?
Yeah,
and
yes.
Okay.
And also the person who is going to speak.
Yeah,
Yeah, no. You can mute answer yourself, Vijayan. I muted all. Unmute and you can talk. Unmute and talk, Vijayan.
Yes.
Okay.
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. So, welcome to Tamil Nadu Science Forum. So, on behalf of Popular Science Lecture Branch of Tamil Nadu Science Forum, I extend my warm welcome to you all. This is our 34th lecture since we launched the lecture in June 2018. Since then, we have been able to conduct the lecture periodically without any interruption, covering the ongoing researches in higher sciences. Our participants are mainly students, researchers, professors, science activists, and those who have got interest in science but missed to have science as their career. Today's lecture is going to be in art and metal technology of solar bronze. We have Dr. Sharda Srinivasan from NIAS with us. I welcome you, ma'am. A brief introduction about PSL and TNSF shall be given by Dr. Seduraman, the state coordinator for subcommittee on science propaganda. On behalf of Tamil Nadu Science for PSL, I welcome you, Dr. Seduraman. The speakers shall be introduced by Dr. TRG, Emeritus Professor from IMSC, an important leader of Tamil Nadu Science Forum. I welcome you, sir. This lecture shall be for 50 minutes to 1 hour, and it shall be in English. Initially, we planned to have it in Tamil, but we want to provide more opportunity for the audience to interact with the speaker. We don't want to take much time in translating the lectures. So after this, we have a question answer session, and I request you to all of you mute your mic. That's always it has already been done, and please keep your mic mute. We expect you to bear with us. During the question answer session, you can raise your hand and chat with the speaker directly, or you can write your question in the chat box. We are comfortable with the questions in the chat box because we can read one after another and start answering it. We expect you to ask questions related to the speech given by the speaker and do not express your opinion on the subject. Please find the link for the feedback form, which is going to be put it in the chat box. We request you to fill up the feedback forms immediately after the meeting, as it will help us to review and improve our activities. So let me hand over my mic to Dr. Seduraman, who will introduce the Tamil Nadu Science Forum.
Good evening to all. Tamil Nadu Science Forum, Science for the People, Science for the Nation. Tamil Nadu Science Forum, அறிவியல் மக்களுக்கே அறிவியல் நாட்டிற்கே என்ற ஒரு உயரிய நோக்கத்துடன் தமிழ்நாட்டில் அறிவியல் பரப்புகிற ஒரு முக்கியமான அமைப்பாக செயல்பட்டு வருகிறது. தமிழ்நாடு சயின்ஸ் ஃபாரம் 1981 ஸ்டார்ட் செய்யப்பட்டு அறிவியலை மக்களிடத்துல கொண்டு செல்லக்கூடிய ஒரு விவசாய முதல் விஞ்ஞானிகள் வரை, ஒரு ஃபார்மர்ல இருந்து ஒரு சயின்டிஸ்ட் வரை கொண்ட ஒரு அமைப்பு. இதில் எல்லோரும் அறிவியலை பரப்ப வேண்டும், எல்லோரிடத்திலும் அறிவியலை கொண்டு செல்ல வேண்டும் என்ற நோக்குடன் இது செயல்பட்டு வருகிறது. தமிழ்நாடு சயின்ஸ் ஃபாரம் 6 சப்தீம் ஒர்க் பண்றோம். அந்த அடிப்படையில சயின்ஸ் பாப்புலரேஷன், சயின்ஸ் சம்பந்தமான லெக்சர்ஸ், சயின்ஸ் சம்பந்தமான நிறைய விஷயங்களை கொண்டு செல்ல சயின்ஸ் பாப்புலரேஷன், கம்யூனிகேஷன் ஒரு சப்கமிட்டியும், எஜுகேஷன் ரிசர்ச், எஜுகேஷனுடைய புது புது விஷயங்களை கொண்டு செல்ல எஜுகேஷன் சப்கமிட்டின்னு ஒரு சப்கமிட்டியும், ஆண் பெண் சமத்துவத்தை வலியுறுத்த ஈக்குவாலிட்டி என்ற ஒரு சப்கமிட்டியும், மற்றும் சயின்ஸ் நிறைய புத்தகங்களை வெளியிடுவதற்காக சயின்ஸ் எஜுகேஷனுக்கான ஒரு சப்கமிட்டியும், சயின்ஸ் அறிவியல் வெளியீடு என்ற ஒரு சப்கமிட்டியும், மற்றும் யூத் ஃபார் சயின்ஸ், யூத்து கிட்ட சயின்ஸை கொண்டு போறதுக்காக யூத் ஃபார் சயின்ஸும், மற்றும் பள்ளி மாணவர்களிடத்துல துளிர் இல்லம் என்ற ஒரு விஷயமும் கொண்டு சென்றுட்டு இருக்கும். அதே போல லேண்ட்ல நிலம், நீர், விவசாயம், அக்ரிகல்ச்சர், இந்த டெவலப்மெண்ட் பத்தி எல்லாம் ஆய்வு செய்து மக்களிடத்துல ஒரு சரியான பார்வையை, புதிதலை உருவாக்க டெவலப்மெண்ட் என்ற சப் கமிட்டியும் கொண்டு இருக்கும். இந்த தமிழ்நாடு சயின்ஸ் ஃபாரம் தொடர்ந்து பல விஷயங்களை செய்யுது. அதுல குறிப்பா இந்த பாப்புலர் சயின்ஸ் லெக்சர் இந்த நேரடியாக நடைபெற்றது. தற்போது இந்த கொரோனா பேண்டமிக் பீரியட்ல இந்த மாதிரி ஜூம் வழியாக பல அரிய கருத்தாளர்களை, உலகளாவிய கருத்தாளர்களை மக்களிடத்துல ஒரு அறிவியலே ஒரு சரியான பாதையில கொண்டு செல்வதற்கான இந்த நிகழ்ச்சி நடத்துறோம். இது போல தமிழ்நாடு சயின்ஸ் ஃபாரம் நிறைய புக்ஸ் குழந்தைகளுக்காக துளிர், ஜந்தர் மந்தர் போன்ற மேகசின்ஸ் தொடர்ந்து வெளியிட்டு வரோம். போல பல விஷயங்களை செய்துட்டு இருக்கிறோம். இதோட ஒரு முக்கியமான விஷயம், சயின்ஸை எல்லோரும் கத்துக்கணும், அதே போல கத்துக் கொடுக்கணும் அப்படின்ற ஒரு உயரிய நோக்கத்துடன் சயின்ஸை கொண்டு சென்றுட்டு இருக்கும். இந்த நிகழ்ச்சியை ஏற்பாடு செய்கிற குழுவினருக்கும் மற்றவர்களுக்கும் தமிழ்நாடு சயின்ஸ் ஃபாரத்தோட ஸ்டேட் டீமோட வாழ்த்துக்களையும் நன்றிகளையும் தெரிவித்துக் கொள்கிறோம். நன்றி, வணக்கம்.
DRG, please introduce the speaker.
Okay, all friends, it's my pleasant duty to introduce the speaker, Prasa Sharda Srinivasan. Actually, she has been very kind in spite of her extraordinary busy time. Now, several Zoom lectures, Google Meet lectures are going side by side. And she has agreed to speak to us, partly because probably I impressed her with my knowledge of some of the questions in astrophysics and Chola period. She did her BTech from IIT Bombay, Engineering Physics, which is very popular course, but she was probably the first set of students in that kind of a course where people do both engineering and physics. And then she moved on to archaeology with her knowledge in engineering, physics, and questions in metallurgy, etc. Archaeology, she has done extraordinary work. I'm not going to dwell because already we have circulated her background. There are several things which are interesting. Of course, she is Padma Shri and great honor from the country, and also great lineage. Her father is M.R. Srinivasan, who was actually chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. And of course, the same erudition, etc., you can see in her writings. And I'm very happy that she agreed to speak. And also she is, for those of you who may not know, she is granddaughter of C.P. Ramasamy Iyer. Am I right? Okay, anyhow, that is only lineage part which makes it very interesting. I have personal interest in this topic about Chola metallurgy, partly because I'm from Kumbakonam. And I have been to these places like Swamimalai, Nageshwara Goil, Uppiliyappan Goil, various places, Thanjavur, etc. so many times by cycle when I was a school student. At that time, it was very impressive to visit the places where people do those work. And obviously, I usually ask this question, who taught them? How was it done? Where is this tradition coming from? And it's very impressive that that kind of a technology was having a connection to nearly 1,000 years, which is very impressive. And of course, we have to modernize much more with new metals, etc. There is no doubt. But the metallurgy of that period, which played a role in many various activities of temples and even day-to-day activities, are very impressive. And we always want to learn what motivated them. As a physicist and mathematician, I always ask this question, who was the engineer who built the Bhagadiswara temple? That we don't even know. We know only the king who built. He didn't build it. He didn't take a stone and put it there. Probably laid the foundation. But obviously a chief engineer, an architect who had a vision of the whole thing right from the beginning must have been there. and structures are extremely interesting. I've always been fascinated. I always call them, what was the mathematics they knew? Because without that kind of a thing, engineering, mathematics, material sciences, etc., you are not going to be successful in achieving this kind of a thing. So I'm very happy that this topic is chosen, and that is why I put a lot of pressure on her to speak about this. I'm very curious to find out what she's going to say more about, particularly Chidambaram and other things. And Chidambaram, I actually have a personal connection to me because I was born there. Okay, anyhow, it's more than that. She's from National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. She's a professor there, and she has several books to her credit, and also several articles which has been coming, which you can easily go to her website. Details are easily available. We have already displayed some of them in our introduction, and I don't want to take too much time in this inaugural business. I will now hand over to Dr. Prasa Sharda to start her lecture. Thank you very much. Unmute.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we can.
So, Vanakkam, and it's wonderful to be on this program of the Tamil Nadu Science Forum, and Romba Sandosham that you've extended this invitation to me, and and thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and which is really sort of inspires me to aspire even further, so to speak. And also it was, I must say I'm very intimidated because, you know, your own background is such a extraordinary scientist, and the work of the Tamil Nadu Science Forum with so many distinguished scientists. So I really don't know if I will live up to the expectations, but thank you very much for the opportunity. And I think it's very important, the mandate of this Tamil Nadu Science Forum, which I think is very close to my heart as well, in terms of you know, drawing together dialogues of science and society, as it were, and also at the institution where I've been working recently, NIAS, which is to do with interdisciplinary perspectives, bringing together science and the humanities and so on. So it's a great opportunity. Thank you. And so my topic today is on the art and metal technology of Chola Bronzes. Of course, again, that's a topic that needs no introduction to all of you. And as you, sir, is also from Kumbakonam, and I'm sure many of you probably know these sites even better than I do. But anyway, perhaps because I've tried to apply a different lens, as I said, interdisciplinary perspectives, perhaps I can, you know, spark off at least new lines of exploration and questioning and so on. And so I will share my screen without further ado. Yeah. So can you see my PPT now?
Yes,
Yes, madam. Yes, yes.
Yeah. Is it clear?
Yes.
Yes, it's clear.
Yes, it is clear.
Great. So, so thank you for pointing out my journey, which in a way, I went in from engineering physics to metallurgy, but that was also because I had a connection intrinsically as a Bharatanatyam dancer also towards certainly the art of Nataraja and Chola Bronzes. And so it seemed in a way, a natural progression for me after my studies at IIT, which Professor was mentioning, to try and look at what the scientific investigations kind of light that could be thrown on art and archaeological objects, which is still a bit of a niche study and so on, the discipline of archaeomaterials or archaeosciences and so on. But I think the significance of these areas is of course growing as we go along. So just to give a bit of a archaeological perspective, of course, the prevalence of metal icons, which is in a way in the current times perhaps best exemplified by the Chola Bronzes. It does have a long history in the Indian subcontinent, going back to the celebrated dancing girl from Mohenjo-daro, which it's a very tiny bronze, but there are several elements of continuity, I guess, which are also resonant even today. For example, this tiny figure of the dancing girl also shows the stance that she stands in is something that we commonly describe as a dancing posture. And then she has this armful of bangles, which when I was excavating in Dholavira, which is a Harappan site in Gujarat, I was immediately struck by the fact that there are Rabari women wear shell bangles all the way up their arms and things like that. And the way in which she has her hair done to the side in a bun, again, that is something which resonates a lot. You'll see a lot of the women in more remote areas like the Kotas and the Nilgiris and so on, still wearing their hair just like that with the side bun and so on. And although we generally see that there is some kind of a hiatus in the post-Harappan period, leading up to the early historic period, when again you start seeing statuary figurines more prominently in the Indian subcontinent, there are a few, there are more and more finds now which maybe are filling up this hiatus. Of course, it's still a hiatus, but still there are more and more artifacts which are coming to light. For example, you're also looking at the well-known elephant from Daimabad in Maharashtra, which is attributed to the late Harappan of about 1500 BCE. And that's an interesting example also, because it seems to be made as a solid casting, which means that it is totally one piece of metal. And as I'll explain, that is also the process which still survives very much in the South Indian context and the Tamil and Chola bronzes and so on. And this figure of the elephant also has these lugs with the holes, which again is a little, it's very interesting, even though it's such a chronologically separated period, it does instantly remind you of the kind of lugs that you see in South Indian bronzes, which were typically for putting a bamboo pole through it for carrying images out in procession and so on. So it does bring to mind whether it had some kind of analogous function. Of course, the contexts are too separated really to make any conclusive comments. And you also have this rather remarkable, again, a rather isolated find, but significant nonetheless, of a mother goddess from Adichanallur, attributed to about 800 BCE, which is in the Government Museum, Chennai. And so that you can see it was probably cast in a flat two-piece mold. And that also resonates with the Harappan mother goddess terracottas, of course. And there are some other animal figurines also, such as from Adichanallur and Kodumanal megalithic context of about 3rd century BC, and these animals with finials from Adichanallur, which looks to be goats from those very long years. And there's this rather fine figurine of a tiger from Kodumanal, which is also inlaid with carnelian and lapis lazuli. And lapis, of course, was coming typically all the way from Afghanistan. So it suggests that there were long distance exchanges and so on. So there is, this tradition of icons and statuary. Although it does seem to sort of, I won't say it is entirely sort of emerging out of a void, but there aren't too many precedents. But it is good to note more and more that we are finding that there are some artifacts filling up this gap. Well, the Imperial Cholas, of course, they need no introduction to this audience, but they were munificent patrons under whom magnificent temples were built, and a prolific number of bronzes of icons of different religious affiliations, of course, mainly Hindu, but also some Buddhist and Jain were also cast. And the 11th century Brihadishwara temple, which was built by Nataraja Choran in between 985 to, who lived between 985 to 1014 CE, and it was consecrated in 1010 CE, is the great masterpiece. And this temple also is said to have had about 60 metal icons dedicated according to inscription. And of this, of course, only a couple are now extant in the temple. And you're looking at that set, which is still in worship in the temple. And so those are the only two which are still found in the temple. And typically, the Chola inscriptions describe South Indian bronzes as Cheppu Theramani, or copper images of the Lord. And of course, few of the Hindu icons were anyway inscribed because they were intended as deities. But you do find that some of the Buddhist icons have donor images, and also also with the Jain images. But the large majority of Hindu icons are not actually inscribed. And that also brings us to one of the problems in terms of the technical aspect, and as to what technical study can contribute in terms of art historical study, which is that, and as I will explain, these are also solid castings, so that, you can't typically use methods like carbon dating for inorganic materials, which don't have charcoal in them. And so when it's a solid piece of metal, then what are the techniques that may be available in terms of classifying them or categorizing them and calibrating them? So looking at the metal composition in various ways in this case is the major option, and I'll explain how that was attempted in the studies that I've undertaken. Of course, you also have the celebration of the imagery of the Nataraja at the Brihadishwara temple. Adavalan, or as is known in Tamil, was the Kula Devata, or the family deities of the Cholas. And this image was cast as processional images, or Utsava Murtis, or festival icons. And this particular bronze that you're looking at, which is from Velankani, the Nataraja, which is in the Government Museum, Chennai. And art historians have also been agreed that this is probably attributable to Rajaraja Cholan, dated to about 985 CE. And so this was, I'm sorry, I should have said that the 985 to 1014 was the period of, anyway, let's get on with the talk and come back to all that later. Yeah, so now I had the technique that I'd actually used to analyze these bronzes and characterize them. I'll come to that later, but I'll just point out here that this was actually technically fingerprinted from lead isotope analysis and trace element analysis to the Chola period. And if you can see, it also has certain aspects of similarity with the icon which is in worship in the Brihadishwara temple. It has more of an oval kind of Prabhavali, or the ring of fire, so to speak. And of course, there's another interesting aspect, which is that when you come to the stone depictions, usually what happens is that sculptures in the Indian context are dated by means of the inscriptions on the temples in which the sculptures are found, because the temples tend to have inscriptions, of course, such as the Brihadishwara temple itself, which has over 60 inscriptions of Rajaraja Cholan itself. And you're looking here at the Nataraja image in the Brihadishwara temple, which it actually has these traces, of course, of painting. But what is also interesting is that you can see that the imagery, in a way, is something which the stone that they were using, which is a very hard charnakite. I mean, stone actually doesn't have as good tensile strength as metal. And so in a way, the bronze form with that Prabhavali and so on had better tensile strength to enable the casting of this particular iconography. And if you look at that stone image, you'll see that the lifted leg has a bit of a strut, which is popping up the lifted leg. And the way in which the hand and the leg, the serpent has been carved in stone, almost connecting the hand and the leg. And this is probably also because they would have encountered this aspect of the tensile strength of stone not being as good as metal. And so there's a good chance that bits of these would break off if they didn't have these kinds of prop-ups. So it's interesting how iconography is also shaped by technology in a way. We always think of the symbolism and so on emerging, as it were, as if the aesthetic idea is what precedes it. But I think the technology also imposes certain parameters within which certain artistic constructs come into play. And of course, typically also the geometric aspect of the Nataraja, where it is said to be formulated within what is called a six-sided star or Satguna. That also you see here, particularly in the way that dhoti is being draped, the Angavastram is being draped around the Brihadishwara image and so on. Well, of course, coming to some of the masterpieces of the Chola Bronzes, the most celebrated, there's a lot of background. I don't know whether somebody has been muted. Yeah, I think that's better. Coming to the masterpieces of Chola Bronzes, one of the inscriptions also mentions that the deva or deity is generally Ghanamaga, which means solid, and the Rishabha or the bull is Chaitya or hollow. And that's also been cited by P.R. Srinivasan and Nagaswami and so on. And that's quite interesting because obviously there was some aspect of auspicion where in the South Indian tradition, the main images were preferred to be made as solid castings, whereas sometimes the accessories like the Rishabha or the bulls and so on could be hollow cast. And if you look at that image of Rishabha Vahana Deva and consort from Natanapurishwara temple in Tandantotam, which is attributed to the Aditya Chola school of about the latter part of the 10th century, you'll see that the bull, the Vahana, has, the legs are damaged. And you can see that because that had actually a clay core. So in the solid casting, as I'll explain later, the whole casting was first executed in a solid piece of wax, so that when it was cast, it was actually of solid metal. But you can see here that the bull had a clay core on top of which a thinner layer of metal was applied. And so that when it was cast, it really it retains this clay core. And sometimes, of course, there has been a use of the clay core also for dating images, if those are available, but it's not very prevalent with South Indian images. Although, mind you, the clay cores were used quite a lot, for instance, in Hellenistic bronzes, a lost wax technique with hollow casting. So, but this is an instance where you actually see a correlation between the inscription and the technology. And in the center, you're looking at the very celebrated example of Shiva as Rishabha Vahana, which is the pastoral form of Shiva with the consort Parvati, which is a very acclaimed masterpiece. And these images in the Thanjavur Art Gallery have been correlated to inscriptions in the Nageshwara temple in Tiruvangadu. And the inscription suggests that such a set of images were donated in 1011 and 1012 in the period of Rajaraja. And another very celebrated masterpiece is the Ardhanarishwara, which is of the early 11th century, which is also from Tiruvangadu, which is now in the Government Museum, Chennai, which typically depicts Shiva and Parvati conjoined. And you can see that that also, in a way, draws from the Rishabha Vahana and the consort and the bull Nandi all coming together, as it were, because if you look at this image of Ardhanarishwara from Nageshwara, which is dated to the 9th century, about the same time that the Natanapurishwara temple bronzes were probably made. And you can see that the Nandi is just standing behind Ardhanarishwara, and here the female half is also holding a mirror. And so this is also the attitude of the celebrated Ardhanarishwara, which is in the Government Museum, Chennai, where you can see the hand might have rested on the bull, and the other hand of Parvati symbolically would have held the mirror. So what is quite beautiful to me is this way in which the stone, the different media are sort of interacting, and different forms which are developing in one medium are influencing the other, and also the differences within the use of particular casting techniques like hollow and solid and so on. Well, it was Ananda Kumaraswamy who probably brought the Chola bronzes to the kind of limelight that they have eventually earned internationally in his very celebrated essay on Dance of Shiva. And he wrote of the Panchakritya, or the 5 activities of Shiva, from 13th century Shaiva Siddhantic texts, where he spoke of how the drum of creation is held in one hand, Srishti, and then you have Samhara, or the fire of destruction, in the other hand, both of which are being balanced. And Shiva, as the dancing deity, has this aureole or prabhavali of fire, which is said to depict the perpetual cosmic cycles. And he dances on top of the dwarf demon described as Apasmara in Sanskrit, but also as Muyalagan in Tamil, which relates to the hair. And so he wrote also very evocatively that this image was poetry, but nonetheless science, about how, in a way, the poetic vision has also been brought together by a mastery of the technology of bronze casting. And I had also analyzed this bronze and found it to be of 8% tin and 8% lead by a technique which is called inductively coupled optical emission spectroscopy. And I'll come to those technical details a bit later. But what I also wanted to mention here is that Ananda Kumaraswamy had also characterized this very important and beautiful bronze, which is in the Freer Gallery of Art, as perhaps representing a portrait bronze of the widowed Queen Sembian Mahadevi. Of course, this is a bit of a conjecture on the part of Kumaraswamy, but this is another very outstanding bronze masterpiece, where you see a Devi who is typically standing with a hand in Kapita, and she has a certain regal bearing, and she's also wearing a sacred thread, which is associated with usually with male learning, Brahminic learning and so on. But here it is also something which seems to have been was also sported by women and royal women and so on. And it is really under her patronage that we see the Nataraja bronze and the stone forms perhaps coming much more prominently into vogue. And the Adityarai temple has a very fine sculpture of Nataraja, which is an early sculpture of Nataraja, where he's seen properly rounded in the 3-dimensional stone form. And there is also a set of Nataraja and Shivagami, which is also in that temple. And she was also very renowned, so much so that a town was named after her. And according to inscription, deified images of her were taken around in procession on her natal star. She was also widowed quite early, because her husband Gandharaditya Chola became a devotee of Shiva and fasted himself to death. And thereafter, she went on with many of her acts of patronage. And there's also an inscription of Rajendra, which mentions offerings to her image. And it's also significant that there is an inscription from Adityarai, which actually mentions the artisan communities, including the bronze workers and the Kamala. And Of course, occasionally we also see that there are bronzes of for instance, the mason who constructed the wall of the Brihadareshwara temple. There is a depiction of him, but there are very seldom depictions of the actual artisans and metal casters and so on. So some of these inscriptional data and so on become significant. And of course, women also played a major role in patronage, not just the queen or the Nampiratiyar, but also the Nachiyar or temple dancers in attendance and so on. Well, the bronze casting tradition survived in several parts of Thanjavur district, but today it is predominantly found in Swamimalai around the banks of the Kaveri River, which provided much of the alluvial silt and clay for making the molds. And in fact, it's very good that recently there's also been a geographical indicator patent, which has been awarded to the Swamimalai bronze casting tradition. And typically, as I was talking about it earlier, the solid casting technique meant that a wax model is first made of the icon, and then it is invested with numerous layers of clay to make the mold. And then the mold is heated and the wax is melted and expelled. And then the metal to be casted is heated and poured in. And these photographs that you're looking at is also from the workshop of Radha Krishna and Shrikanda Sthapati and Swaminathan Sthapati, whom I had been interacting actually going back to 1990 in my years of doctorate. Throughout of the aspects of ritual coming together with technology. And so I was talking about the solid lost wax casting process, and you're seeing here Radha Krishna Sthapati making first making the carving, and they use a traditional system of measurement and modeling and so on. They're using the Odiole, which is a palm strand, and this palm frond is broken up and folded up in different parts. In this case, 124 parts, which represent the male figure and so on. And so they keep unfolding the ole and marking out the proportions of the icon. And it's useful because it is very flexible, and so it works well in 3 dimensions and such like. And the wax model is, of course, made up of different layers of wax and then covered with 3 layers of clay, 3 layers of molding clay. And this account of casting is also to be found in Shilpa texts such as the Manasara and the Manasollasa, which mention the Madhu Chestha Vidhana, or the lost wax process in Sanskrit, which is basically one of making a model of wax and then investing it to form the mold and then melting out the wax and pouring in the metal to solidify into the casting. And what you're looking at below here is also this process of the de-waxing, where the mold is covered with numerous of the cow dung cakes or rati and heated with complete combustion, and then uniformly heated, and then the wax is melted out, and inside the hollow the metal is poured. But it's also interesting that there is a lovely metaphorical reference to the casting process in the Tamil poetry of Andal, the mystic woman saint of the 9th century and devotee of Shiva. In the Nachiyar Tirumori, she likens the downpour of rain from clouds to the metaphor of the release of wax from the mold in the process of the metal casting. And she evokes Lord Krishna as an avatar of Vishnu, who she is dedicated to as a skilled craftsman. And she mentions also the Ulla Melidu Uriki Venkalamutra, which is that the Melidu, or the wax, melts out and Vengalam, the bronze, is poured in. And that process is reminiscent to some of these evocative ideas that she mentions. Now, coming to the actual casting process, one of the aspects is that metal by itself, bronze by itself, is not very viscous, which means that it doesn't flow very easily. And to make it more viscous or make it easier to flow, you need to have these runners, which are basically these components which connect the different parts such as the attributes and so on, to make the metal more easy to flow. And if you look at this unfinished Vishnu, which is in the Prince of Wales Museum, you can see it gives you an idea of the pouring technique, where there is one sprue which is at the back of the image, and then you have these runners and such like. So basically, it's a process of casting it by keeping it face down and pouring from the rear at different locations. But today they use slightly different methods. They could perhaps be a method of just pouring from one orifice and just one sprue, depends on the size of the mold, and then the mold is buried into the sand and such like for the pouring. But for example, this was the 15th century image, which is unfinished again, Nilapadi Krishna, which was technically fingerprinted to the Vijayanagara period, which had 5% lead and 2% tin. And that seems to have also been poured by keeping it flat like this. And you can see how the intact runners are also cut off in the foundry and such like at the bottom. And you'll see that there are certain details also which are associated with the Manasolasa and so on, which are touched upon. For instance, the use of a lighted wick near the mouth, which also maintains certain reducing conditions by preventing the formation of an oxidized fire skin and so on. So some of these approaches are also intended to optimize the properties, as it were, of a good casting. Now, so I had used this technique called, bulk compositional analysis through Icp Oes. And I won't go into the technical process too much, except to say that I had analyzed for about 18 elements, including the major, minor, and trace elements. And what it was found that about 80% of the South Indian images were leaded bronzes, and the rest were leaded brasses. And along with the lead isotope analysis technique, which I'll explain, I was able to group together the bronzes based on certain similarities in the trace elements and so on, by comparing them with well-dated images of the different periods, such as Vijayanagara or Pallava and Chola and so on, so as to form these technical fingerprints for different groups of bronzes. And anyway, so I won't go into the detail of this, mainly to say that more of the Chola bronzes were actually having tin of about 6% and so on. And from going from about 5 to 15% tin and so on, depends, but they're all in the alpha solid solution of bronze, really, because beyond 15%, it becomes, it's no longer the alpha solid solution. So these are basically low leaded tin bronzes, and there are also some of the brasses, and more brasses could be found also in the later periods. One thing I would like to make clear, though, is that quite often in the popular parlance, these images are referred to as Panchaloha, or 5 metalled icons. But that should really be seen as more symbolic rather than literal, because these are typically leaded bronzes, which means that they have lead and tin alloyed to copper, or they are leaded brasses, which is lead and zinc alloyed to copper again. And, even in practical terms, you really can't get a major alloy with 5 different major alloying constituents, major and minor constituents. So, it doesn't make practical sense in that sense. So these terms like Panchaloha and all had more of Shastric significance because of the connection with Shaiva Siddhantic notions of the Panchabhuta, or the 5 elements and so on. And you can see that quite clearly also from the analysis that apart from these, the minor elements of zinc, lead, and tin, all the other elements are trace, or not more than about 1% and so on. As I was talking about, yes, and you're looking at a microstructure of one of the leaded bronzes, which typically has this cast dendritic structure. And the lead is also found in the intergranular spaces, because lead is not soluble in copper, so it tends to segregate in the intergranular spaces, whereas the tin, if it's below 15%, it tends to go into a solid solution. And the lead was typically added to make bronze more castable. And at the bottom, you're looking at a radiograph of a Pallava 7th century bronze, which had also been done by me in collaboration with IGCAR many years ago. And you can see that the radiograph shows that it is a solid casting. So coming to the technique that one had tried to use to actually discriminate between different schools of bronzes based on the sources of metal used, the technique of lead isotope ratio analysis is quite useful because the isotopic ratios of leaded artifacts vary discretely according to the source of lead. And so if certain artifacts come from a particular source of lead, then they'll have the lead isotope ratios clustering together for those particular sources. As you know, the idea being that at different points in time, different sources of lead or different sources of metal would have been accessible or would have been exploited by the various dynasties and so on. And of course, there needs to be a lot more work done in terms of actually getting the data on the lead isotope ratios of different mining sites and different ore sources. Now, I'll also say that this is more sensitive in a way than just using trace element analysis, because certain elements can be chalcophilic, like nickel, cobalt, antimony, bismuth, and so on. And as I've pointed out here, there is some correlation of the trace elements of these 5 elements, which can be linked to the fact that the copper sources may have been the same. But that's not such a sensitive technique as lead isotope ratio analysis, because the isotopic ratios are not really changed very much during the smelting processes and so on. And hence, this can be a much more powerful fingerprinting technique. And if we did have the data bank of a lot of the isotopic ratios, then you can actually match some of the artifacts to the ore sources. For example, this is a Ganesha image from Nellore, which is of the 18th century Maratha period. And that had lead isotope ratios which very well matched Dariba, which is a mine in Rajasthan. And so very likely the metal was in this period, at least for this artifact, it seems to come from Rajasthan. And at the bottom, you're seeing a Santinatha image, which is a giant Tirthankara, which is an inscribed image, inscribed to 12th century of the Solanki period. And that matched the lead isotope ratios for the mine in Ambaji in Gujarat when I had undertaken that analysis. And this was found to have a 24% brass, which means a 24% zinc alloy to it. Now, it's also interesting because you do have a tradition of zinc exploitation in northern India. We know that the Zawar area in Rajasthan was famous for having the earliest evidence for full-fledged evidence for zinc smelting going back to about the 12th century. Because before this, metallic zinc was not very widely in vogue, and this is around this time that metallic zinc starts getting exploited. But in this case, this artifact does not actually match Zawar, but Ambaji, so there may have been some other sources of brass around that region. But for the bulk of the South Indian images, we haven't very successfully been able to identify the ore sources. But where it doesn't actually matter in terms of looking at the implications for classification of artifacts and the art historical study and so on, or the study of the provenance and the technical fingerprinting, is that one was still able to see that there are very discrete lead isotope ratio fingerprints for bronzes of different schools. For instance, the Vijayanagara bronzes all had lead isotope ratios which fell into a particular ellipse 2A, I would say. And the Chola pieces had lead isotope ratios which fell more into the ellipse 1A. So what that actually tells us is that though we don't know where this mining area is in general, that it could have been even different mines within a larger mining area, but it certainly means that the primary ore from similar sources were used at a particular period. Anyway, I won't go too much into that, except to say that from these analyses, there are some implications for the stylistic study of the bronzes, which I will go into. And of course, I've published a lot on the lead isotope ratios, which people can always look at those papers and so on. And I really have a lot to, I don't know how much time I have, but I have a lot to say actually about the implications from the lead isotope ratio analysis for the stylistic study, which I'll just try to touch upon very quickly. So one of the images that I had actually studied was this yakshi with the goose from the Victor and Albert Museum, which had 10% tin and 9% lead, so leaded bronze. And now this had, it wasn't very sure whether this was an image from northern India or from southern India, because early historic yakshis are also found in stone sculpture very much in the tradition in Bharhut and so on, and the Kushan period as well. But the lead isotope ratios of this actually didn't match any of those Western Indian mines that I showed you in the earlier slide, but it actually was consistent with a few other artifacts which I would attribute to the early historic period from southern India. So that this seems to really have been from southern India. And you can see that stylistically also it has certain correlations with other early historic artifacts from South India. For instance, the very famous relief of the Dream of Maya from Amravati of the Andhra Shatavahana period, where you see again, she has a very similar attitude to this yakshi. And there is also the find from Arikamedu of the 1st century, the Indo-Roman site of this of the shard, which has this depiction of a lady with a mirror, where again the stance is a bit similar to this yakshi. And also this very beautiful gold signet ring from Karur in Tamil Nadu of the 1st century with a Mithuna couple, which you know, the signet ring is more of an Indo-Roman style, but unfortunately that has gone missing, but it was illustrated in Nagaswami's book. And again, that has some resonances with this, this yakshi. So it seems to be, as I said, likely that it was really from southern India. And of course, by putting together the lead isotope data along with the trace element analysis, also a certain amount of clustering was found for different periods. And I'm just pointing to some typical high Chola pieces, which I had studied. One of this is the Shivakami from Karaiviram from Thanjavur district, which has a pedestal inscription of 917 CE and mentions Parantaka Chola and Uma Bhattaraki. Of course, I haven't sampled that image, but I've put that in to also mention that that is one of the very few inscribed Chola pieces actually. And but what I had studied was this Somaskanda from Nidur, the Parvati, and of course the entire Somaskanda set, which is in the Government Museum, Chennai. And of course, the kind of analysis one did in those days was using a very, very fine micro drilling technique, which takes out no more than about 10 to 50 milligram of sample, and then it's subjected to simultaneous multi-element analysis and so on. And so this had 12% tin and 8% lead. And this was fingerprinted typically to the High Chola period, as was this other very beautiful Parvati image again from Thiruvengi Malay from the Government Museum, Chennai. And another interesting aspect is that of some of the finds of the Buddhist bronzes. Now in the center, you're looking at a very fine Nagapattinam Buddha. Well, Nagapattinam Buddha in the sense that actually it is in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it is it was thought likely that it could be from Nagapattinam, but of course you know, there is, when you find some of these gilt Buddhist images, there is also always a question of you know, whether this was made in Tamil Nadu or whether it was there a Sri Lankan connection, because Sri Lanka of course also had a strong Buddhist tradition. And so this is where the technical analysis was very useful. And this image is gilded, and typically the compositional analysis showed that it had about 1% lead, very low lead. And that's very sensible when you're trying to gild an object, because if you have too much of lead, then there's a lot of sublimation and it interferes with the gilding process. So this is why it had a less amount of gilding, because this is following a process of mercury gilding. And so for this image, the lead-isotope ratios and the trace element analysis and so on, it fitted actually a late Chola attribution of about, say, 12th century. And that also is consistent with the style. And it's interesting that though it's a Buddhist image, this also has the holes at the bottom of the lotus base, which shows that it was also being taken around in procession. And just for the comparison of the style, I had put next to it this very famous and spectacular example of the Sultanganj Buddha in Birmingham, which is of the late Gupta period of about 6th, 7th century. And that is, in fact, the largest surviving image from the subcontinent. And as you can see, it's really towering, life size, and so on. And interestingly, though there is a stylistic similarity, that particular Sultanganj Buddha is made by hollow casting, which is the technique that was used much more in northern and northwestern India, which also came in with the Hellenistic influence by the early historic period from the Greco-Bactrian influence and so on. And but you do see some early holocaust images. For instance, this Avalokiteshvara image from the Krishna Delta, that is holocaust. And you can see that, that's why the way I've taken the photograph, you can see the parts which had the clay core and so on. And that also was consistent with the technical fingerprints for the early historic group that I was mentioning. And just to show you what the radiograph of an image which is holocaust would look like, you can see that this is a holocaust Khmer image, which was studied by Chandra Reddy. And so you can see that there was a clay core in the image. Well, just to put in as a comparison, the gilt Buddha Maitreya of the Pallava era of the 7th century, which is another very important bronze, but unfortunately it was stolen now I think 3 decades ago or so from Government Museum Chennai, which is one of the very important early Pallava images. And you can see also it has very strong links to the Pallava style, you know, the style that you see in the rathas, I just put in as an example, with the typical Kati Sutra, sashes, and so on. And that's also why the technical investigations is important to be able to so-called, you know, have a way of fingerprinting and authenticating artifacts and such like. Now, this image of Rama that you see, which is now in the Victoria and Albert Museum, of the 15th century, had also been fingerprinted by me to the Vijayanagara era. And what was also important is that this image, you can still see the bow being held. And this was again a brass image with about 21% zinc. And as I was mentioning, in the Chola period, there were more of bronzes, but you start seeing much more of zinc also being used in the later images, such as this particular Vijayanagara Rama. Though, of course, I'll come back to that. There are some early brasses also from South India. Anyway, so I've just put in here the comparison with a set of Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana in the Ramachandra temple in Hampi, where you see this long bow being held. And of course, the Ramachandra temple is one of the first time that you see a proper full-fledged temple for Rama worship. And I was also part of a program of digital heritage with the which was supported by DST, and which we were helming at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. And last year there was also a major exhibition of Indian digital heritage and at the National Museum, where basically what had been undertaken, this was work done by these collaborative groups in KCST and so on, where the laser scanning of several of the monuments in Hampi had been undertaken, and then a 3D print was made. In this case, you see this 3D print of the Ramachandra temple, and then there was an augmented reality walkthrough and so on. So these are some of the, you know, new directions in terms of representation and study of artifacts and such like. And I was mentioning, of course, that this Rama image was a brass with 21% zinc. And although I did say that not many brasses are found from the earlier periods, it is very interesting that there is evidence for a very early and interesting brass artifact from southern India. And also this coin ingot, a zinc coin ingot, which has, again, it's a Deccan Brahmi inscription. And what was interesting is, of course, as I said, we do know that there was a very early zinc smelting in northern India, in the Zawar region. But there are very few finds of early metallic zinc. And this particular coin ingot with a 4th century Deccan Brahmi inscription had lead isotope ratios which actually fitted my early historic group from southern India, what I call the early, also including Andhra Pallava bronzes and so on. And also this matched very closely that I'd shown you an Andhra Pallava Avalokiteshwara, which was in fact found in the Krishna Delta. And it closely matched that, and it also closely matched this votive bowl, which is an octagonal votive bowl of a Buddhist style, which was also found in the Krishna Delta. And so it confirms that there was some source of early zinc in southern India and somewhere connected with the Andhra region. Whether it was in southern India, but we don't know, but at least this early brass and zinc was available in early historic southern India and the Andhra region. At least wherever that source was. And that was found to have 13% zinc, 8% lead, and 11% tin. So again, this is quite interesting, the kinds of things that these kinds of technical studies can actually tell you and bring to light. And just to point out also that I had done this analysis of a vase, which is now in the Thanjavur Art Gallery, which was fingerprinted to the late Chalukyan period. Again, it is a low zinc brass, low leaded zinc brass. And it's also interesting that there is an inscription of Rajaraja Cholan where he mentions that pittalai or brass was used for making lamps. So some of these lamps are found to be of brass. And I'm also pointing here to a later period brass image of the Chera period, which is in the CSVMS Museum, the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Museum, which in our days used to be called the Prince of Wales Museum. That was when I lived in Bombay in IIT, now in going back to the 80s. And that actually has the eye inlaid with gold and ruby and so on. And that was also a low zinc brass. And just to point out, of course, that as you can make out when you look at that octagonal lamp from the Krishna Delta, it is, you can see that it is actually has some effect of lathe turning. And even today, you see that the molds for the lamps are made by lathe turning in Achar Coil and so on. These are hand-turned lathes, of course, but then that's how they get that very smooth shaping in the wax model. And then after it's invested in with clay and so on, the casting also has this very smooth lathe-turned effect, and then they finish it and so on. So these are some of the aspects. I don't know how much time I have, but I hope I have another 10 minutes. I'll try and run through now. And I was talking also about the digital laser scanning. So in the middle here, you're seeing a laser scanned image of the of the Lakshmi Narasimha in Hampi, which quite often is mistakenly called the Yoga Narasimha because in a later restoration, this Yoga Patha was put. But if you see some of the early photographs of the 19th century by Alexander Greenlaw and so on, that didn't have that Yoga Patha, which is a later restoration. But anyway, this is a very iconic monument which was built by Krishnadevaraya in Hampi. But it's actually a Lakshmi Narasimha image, and the Lakshmi image during the sack of the Battle of Talikota in 1565, the Lakshmi image was destroyed or broken. Well, it's still lying around, but anyway, it was severed from the main image. And this is also to point out here that what you can do with the laser scanning, of course, apart from looking at some of these aspects more closely, it also gives you a sense of the iconometric proportions, the modeling proportions. And in this case, this follows the system of Panchatala, where the tala represents the particular the scale of the measurement. And so this is divided into the 5 talas. And it also correlates, just to give you a sense of what the image would have actually looked like. I've also put in this Lakshmi Narasimha image from Chandragiri, which shows you what it would have looked like with the seated Lakshmi. And there's also the stone Lakshmi Narayana from Bellary district, the Kamalapura Museum. And another image that I'd analyzed was the Bhuvaraha, which you're also looking at here, which is now in the Victor and Albert Museum. And that fitted the technical fingerprints for the Vijayanagara period as well. So you can see that this again has a stylistic consistency with this Vijayanagara group of artifacts. Now I'll come to, of course, the subject of the Nataraja bronze. And one of the very interesting findings from the archaeometallurgical studies was to do with the attribution of images of the dancing Shiva and Nataraja. Because actually there are no inscribed Pallava bronzes as such, although there is this Natesha from Kuram. Of course, when we refer to the forms of the dancing Shiva, there are some which are called Natesha, in which the leg is lifted in different postures known as Urdhvajanu or Chatura Tandava and so on. But the particular Nataraja pose that we associate particularly with the Chola piece that Swami so iconically wrote about, that particular vision has the leg extended in what we describe as the Bhujanga Trasita Karana, which you typically see also in the Bharatanatyam dance repertoire and so on. But it's interesting that that particular posture is not really seen very much outside the Tamil region. And although we typically identify that as being a Chola development, what the lead isotope ratio analysis showed was that there are already some Pallava pieces which not only have the dancing Shiva, but also have this particular formulation of the Bhujanga Trasita Karana. So this was actually probably a Pallava innovation preceding the Chola period. And that really is something which was an insight which I don't think any art historian had written about that until I pointed this out through the technical analysis. So this shows you how there can be a complementarity between art historical studies and technical studies. And so this Natesha from Kuram, well, Kuram was also associated with Pallava era copper plate inscriptions, as pointed out by various art historians. And here you see that the Shiva image there is dancing on this forward-facing dwarf. And this particular Nataraja, a very tiny one, which is in the British Museum, which I had archaeometallurgically fingerprinted and shown that it is of a Pallava vintage. Again, you see that forward-facing dwarf. And this is the first time you see all the complete elements associated with the Nataraja imagery, the halo and the drum and the fire and so on. And you can also see that it has similarities, for instance, with this stone sculptural representation in Kailasanatha Swami temple with the sashes. And there is, however, one depiction of Shiva dancing in Bhujanga Trasita Karana already in the Pallava repertoire in Siyamangalam in a pilaster representation. And you see the leg is, typically lifted. And below him, you also see a serpent. And the Bhujanga Trasita literally means serpent fright. So you can see here there's a charming connection also to this idea of Bhujanga Trasita Karana. And of course, there's also a drummer and so on. Now, another aspect that I should point to is, of course, this is also interesting in terms of the linkages that you can then make to the devotional poetry, because there's already a lot of the poetry of the Nayanma saints, Appar and Sundarar, and poems which talk of the devotion to the Tillai, or the which is the old name for Chidambaram, and the Kutan, which is the dancing form of Shiva who was performing in Tillai and so on. And Chidambaram, of course, is the only shrine which has a tradition of worship of Nataraja in the main sanctum in the anthropomorphic form, as well as in the form of the Akashalingam or the formless ether. So there is this interesting tradition of worship here at Chidambaram as well. And so that idea of the Akashalingam, it also was throwing up the question for me that although, even Kumaraswami's writings he has hinted on this possibility of the, you know, how the image represents the cosmic activity of God and so on. But, you know, to my mind, the question was also, and was there really, you know, a bearing of, let's say, the observations of the skies and so on in the way the image was actually envisaged and so on. So how justifiable is, because that sobriquet really came about through Kumaraswamy's writings, where now, for instance, every museum you go to, the Nataraja is actually described as the cosmic dancer Shiva, but how much of such a sensibility actually informed the creation and so on. And at that time, I'd also collaborated with Dr. Nirupama Raghavan, a well-known astrophysicist who is no more. And one of the interesting aspects of the ritual worship of Nataraja at Chidambaram is that in the month of December, in the month of Margari, right at the end of December, the constellation Orion appears right overhead in the zenith of the temple. And the star Betelgeuse is associated with Arudra, which is the nakshatra or star which is attributed to Shiva. And in some, in the tradition, this is referred to as the Arudra Tandava Darshanam. And one of the late Dikshitar from the temple had also shown me, the Raja Dikshitar had shown me this sketch in the book of Chokolingam, which is described as Arudra Tandava Darshanam. Of course, this is a late book of the 1940s, but it shows the star positions from the constellation Orion in relation to the Nataraja Bronze. And so we just intuitively attempted to do a star chart plotting. And one of these, of course, is a recent one, but one is one that I did with her in collaboration with her. And of course, so this just shows that some of the star positions, they seem to align along the body of the Nataraja image. And that could be one explanation for the lifted leg, because a leg seems to lift towards the position of Sirius, and Sirius is known as Mrigavyada. Of course, I mean, how you know, how accurately all of these are correlated and all that is hard to say, but I suppose that one could say that this kind of visualization, you know, of looking at the stars and so on, could have informed some of the response to the image. And you do have the poem of Manika Vachikar, for instance, which, you know, talks of Adiyam Antamum Illadavar, Mundiya Mudal Nadu, Irudiyo Manai, the one who is without beginning or end, the top and the bottom and the center. And he also sings of, let us praise the dancer, Kutan, who sports, creating, destroying this heaven and earth and all else. And in fact, the Ganapati Stapati also has been in record in 1982 in his book, where he mentions that the Nataraja icon must be visualized within the 6 stars that surround Tiruvadurai, which is Alpha Orionis. Another interesting aspect, of course, is because at the time that these images were being cast, in the mid-11th century, there was a very spectacular astronomical event in 1054. On the July 4th, the explosion of the Crab supernova, which was also most famously observed by the Chinese astronomers who documented it. And it was seen, you know, very brightly, I mean, almost like 2 suns in the sky for at least a few weeks after the supernova explosion, and whether in fact this played any role in the way of visualization. Now, it's quite interesting because, of course, Raghavan is no more, but as she had pointed out to me that even before the crab explosion, it would have been dimming and brightening and things like that. And so, of course, and there is 11th century inscription which is recorded of the commencement of this Brahmotsavam at Chidambaram, which is Ani Thirumanjanam. Of course, one of the Brahmotsavam is related to the Margari festival, but this is the second one, which is very important, which falls in the month of July. And there's an inscription that this started in the mid-11th century, and it is said to have begun when the moon was moon was full in Uttara Nakshatram, which is actually not very far from this possible date of the crab explosion, and whether that commencement of the festival was possibly related to it. But at the moment, that is, until we actually get any more textual evidence, it's a speculation. But anyway, that is an interesting possibility. And also this crab supernova's position somewhere in the region of Taurus and so on is somewhere above the image and so on. And it's also been pointed out that the term Muyalagan also actually means the hair, and lepus in Greek is also the hair. Of course, lepus isn't exactly correlated to Muyalagan, but even so, I mean, just the fact that some of these constellations were visualized in similar ways in the old world. I mean, the Greeks, Orion was a hunter, and for instance, if you look at this Flamsteed Atlas edition of Orion, which was also mentioned by Nirupama Raghavan in her well-known article in INSA on this aspect of correlations of star positions and Shiva and so on. And you can see that actually that kind of position that you see in the Western depiction of Orion, which of course draws from the Greek tradition, there are some echoes there if you see in this particular depiction also of the Gangadhara panel of Shiva in the Kailasanatha temple, where he stands with his right knee up and then Orion along it. And of course in the other one it's some kind of sword of Orion, but here you see it's almost like a flourish with the Ganges or something like that in the other hand of the Gangadhara. So whether there may have been some correlations, and other scholars have also pointed to this. I'm not the only one, nor is Nirupama. For instance, Gift Shiromani had also talked about how this descent of Ganges, there is also this depiction of the dog in the Gangadhara, which correlates to the dog star Sirius, which I was talking about somewhere at the bottom. And Arunachalam, of course, wrote a very seminal book on Chola navigation, where he demonstrates his Gangadhara and the connection with Lepus, though of course Lepus is not exactly right at the bottom. But anyway, the idea of the rabbit in the Tamil, Muyalagan as a hare and Lepus in the Greek as a hare. So there is that interesting connection. Well, I mean, as to why they would have also been looking at stars is because the stars were used for navigation, that is well known. And it has also been suggested by Nachalam and others that Betelgeuse and Betelgeuse or Betelgeuse and Bellatrix were also used in navigation. And the Arab traders who also sailed east were also guided by stars, and apparently some later Arabic texts also mention Chola navigation. And we know that the Cholas also were not just in, and from Sri Lanka, they moved on to Southeast Asia and so on. They were great maritime navigators as well. And of course, the poetic tradition is also quite evocative in a way. And, this idea of connection between the inner space and the outer space, the human and the divine and the cosmic space and so on. There's this verse by Appar in the 7th century, which says, "The Lord of the little chamber filled with honey will fill me with sky, Nilavu, and make me be." And here he's using this term Nilavu, which is in fact preceding the way we know it now as Akasha and ether and so on. And also talking about that connection with Southeast Asia, one is also struck by this prevalence of the imagery of Karaikal Ammayar all the way in Cambodia in the Byantisray temple, where she's seen as this emaciated hag playing cymbals. And she is said to have hailed from a merchant family in the coastal port town of Karaikal in the 6th century. And she prayed to Shiva to become a hag. And some of her poetry is quite searing. While at twilight, effortlessly bearing fire in his palm, and the beautiful nun dances, and she evokes this very Gaulish side of Shiva dancing in the cremation grounds and so on, which also brings us back to this notion of the association of the dance with the dance of destruction and so on. And that particular depiction of Karaikal Ammayar, you'll also see it's very similar to one a particular bronze, which is again attributed to the Sembian Mahadevi period in Thiruvelangadu in the 10th century, which was mentioned also in Nagaswami's book, where she's holding cymbals and her legs are also in a kind of similar, yogikasana. And I was also able to analyze a particular bronze of Karaikal Ammayar, which had 20% lead and 3% tin. And that fitted the technical trends which I would describe of this about the 13th century, the later Pandyan period. And there, that particular image also has these fangs, which you see very clearly. And that fanged version of Karaikal you also see in Cambodia. So, rather than in the other Tamil bronzes. So there seems to be again that, motifs going back and forth between the Tamil region and Cambodia and so on. And of course, the very well-known depiction from Gangai Kondachorapuram, where again you see that the leg is supported by a strut because of the low tensile strength of stone. And there is this depiction of Karaikal Ammayar also in this particular sculpture, which is quite similar to some of these depictions. Now, of course, one point I wanted to make here is also that although I talked about the use of the leaded low-tin bronzes for the Chola bronzes, that's not the only kind of alloy that they had access to. And so there's a deliberate choice here why they used low leaded tin bronze for casting images. Because that particular alloy where the tin doesn't exceed 15% is better suited to casting. But that doesn't mean that they were not aware of the use of bronzes with a higher amount of tin, exploiting the intermetallic properties. And in fact, all the way back in the megalithic period, you have this very spectacular finds, which I don't have time here to go into, but I've given full talks on that. For instance, from Adichanallur, which is now in the Government Museum, Chennai, you have this vessel, which is made of what we call rotten forged high tin bronze, where basically it is a 23% tin bronze, which optimizes the presence of the beta phase of bronze, which has a composition of 22.6% tin and copper. And although bronze gets more and more brittle as you add more and more tin, what happens, and that is why they had to add lead to make the bronze more castable. But at this particular composition of about 23% tin bronze, at a high temperature of about 650 to 700 degrees, it was very plastic and it could be worked very extensively. And that's why you get the forging of this extensive vessel with a very, very thin rim. And after that, it was quenched. And when you quench it, you retain the martensitic needles, which you see in this particular microstructure of that bronze. And this rapid quenching in water is what prevents the embrittlement, because then that embrittling delta phase doesn't form. And these needle-like martensitic beta phase gives the bronze certain additional properties. It makes it more tensile, more durable and corrosion resistant. And it also gives it certain tonalities, musical properties. And hence, this alloy was also being used to make cymbals. And of course, these were known as Ottupatram or Talavettu and, Talam and so on. Many of these traditions have died out, except for instance in Kerala, where I documented and so on. And talking of the symbols that we saw Karaikal Ammayar holding in the 10th century, you can see the same kind of metal was also being used for these symbols. And I was also able to identify a Chola platter of the 10th, 11th century of rotten quenched beta bronze, a heightened beta bronze of 24% tin. So it shows you two things. A, there was this continuity which goes on even into the recent times of making these beta bronze vessels, right from the megalithic period. But it also tells you one more thing, which is that the symbols that you see, the musical symbols also, correlated to this particular tradition that we're looking at over here. But then that brings us to the question of where the tin was coming from, because of course, Southeast Asia has a lot of tin, as we know, and that could have been one, factor for which there was a, trade in tin from Southeast Asia. And we do know that there was an Arab trade also in tin ingots, and, the travels of Abu Zaid and so on do mention that. But so that could have been one source, but certainly an interesting aspect from the archaeometallurgical find is actually it throws more evidence of local sources as well of tin and copper and so on. And one more interesting aspect that I found, when I was talking about that, the Nagapattinam Buddha, because as I was mentioning, you also have Buddhist bronzes, gilt Buddhist bronzes from Sri Lanka. But I found that some of the Sri Lankan objects had quite a significant trace content of iron in them. And in fact, there is a very important copper magnetite ore in Sri Lanka and Seruvula. And that copper iron ore, the copper magnetite deposit could have contributed traces of iron into the castings. So some of those Sri Lankan castings had a significant trace of iron of about at least 1%. But if you saw, for instance, all the analysis of the South Indian bronzes I showed you, they had absolutely very little trace of iron in them. So it seems less likely that the copper source anyway was coming from perhaps Sri Lanka, though it could have been a likely source. And of course, so I don't have time to go into the archaeometallurgy of it too much over here, but I'll just show this one slide which shows, for example, some of the old workings that you see, and I've investigated several of them. And this is from Ingeldal in Karnataka. And that also shows, the use of the technique of fire setting where, to split the rock and things like that. And that's why you see the streaks of soot and things like that. And the malachite was extracted, and there were some slags there which actually had pottery which corresponded to russet-coated ware of the early historic period or the Shatavahana period. And at the bottom, you're looking at, of course, I've talked about optical microscopy, but you can go further and use scanning electron microscopy to study slags and so on. And what this shows you, it's a dot map, and it's an elemental dot map. And so you can see where particular elements are being concentrated. And for instance, so it shows you how the elements are segregating. For instance, it's a copper prill. So you're seeing the central, that little droplet or whatever has copper, more of copper intense areas there. And then it is surrounded by a ring of copper sulfide. And then you also have the iron-rich phalite type slags and all the rest of it, the slaggy matrix and things like that. And another interesting aspect, though, was found some slags also in the region of Kalyadi in Hassan district in Karnataka. And those slags actually, they were not from copper, but they actually had remnants of bronze in them, bronze with 7% tin. And they also had quite a lot of metallic iron in them. So that suggested that these are not slags from just alloying copper and tin, but they seem to have been some slags from co-smelting copper ore and tin ore to yield a bronze of 7% tin, and that I've also published about. So this is just to point out that there was probably a lot more happening in the archaeometallurgical record, which needs to be studied more. And these slags, some of them also had a nickel-cobalt ratio, for what it's worth mentioning, that nickel-cobalt ratio actually was quite similar to what I was finding in the Chola pieces, which also had quite an average of about 7% or 6% tin. So one can't rule out the possibility that there was some local, resources which were also available, or if the tin was coming in or the ores were coming in, those were then being smelted locally. And so there's a lot more to unpack. I think the whole challenge about archaeometallurgy is that, you can just dip. It's really like skimming the surface, and as much as you do, you're just skimming the surface, and there's so much more to really do before you can get to the bottom of this. And you need a lot more of access to materials and samples and resources and funds and all the rest of it as well, access to high-end equipment and so on. This is just some of the publications, including one for Bhuma, which had the CERN Nataraja also, which was donated to CERN by the Indian government. It's on the cover of our book on metals and civilizations. That's, of course, an e-publication, so you can access it. And I think yes, that's my last slide. So thank you very much for giving me a very patient hearing. And I don't know if I've exceeded my time, but anyway, it was wonderful to have this opportunity. Thank you. And I'll stop the screen share now. Yeah.
So let us move on to the question and answer session.
Yeah.
So we have the first question from Dr. Satyanarayanan. He's asking, can you please tell about, is there any significant things between bronze icons of Pallava period and Chola period in terms of making proportions of adding metals?
Yeah, so I think I did cover that, but anyway, I can just reiterate it. If you look at that particular graph, the Chola period has more of tin content, I would say. Pallava bronzes quite often have a lot of copper in them, but the Chola pieces had more of, they're more of leaded bronze composition.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hello, can I ask some question? Couple of questions.
Yeah.
Hello.
So, so I just want to know from the composition of anything which is found out, can we associate exactly the period in which it has been made, like carbon dating?
No, because that's what I was trying to explain here, that carbon dating is something which you can only do on organic material. So that is an absolute dating method. So there is no absolute dating method for metal in that sense, because with the carbon dating, it's like once the lifetime of that, of that living creature, whatever is over, that's when, so the clock starts ticking from then. But so that is one of the reasons why with metal there's no absolute dating. But so what one is, I guess what I've been doing here with the lead isotope analysis and all, you can describe it as a relative dating. It's by calibration, by saying that there is certain characteristics of this group, and you can use that as a calibration for an unknown. So it is a diagnostic tool in a way. But that's also how some of these things are done in archaeology in terms of, for instance, if you want to date glass beads or this or that, then you again undergo all these, you find out these chemical parameters which could be associated with a particular period, and then so you can, see where the attributions of an unknown sample would match. So it's what we call, I suppose in archaeological terms, a relative dating. It's not an absolute dating. Yes.
You didn't mention anything about Jain structures. Mostly
actually, I just had so much and I didn't know. So I think I realized I need a whole talk for that as well, because I have analyzed quite a few Jain bronzes from, some of them are from South Arcot and so on. Well, broadly speaking, they, the ones that I have analyzed are a bit later. They're more from the 13th century. And so they follow these, the Chola trends or whatever. The other curious thing, which I didn't have time to show here, is that although I have analyzed some, I think there is one image of a Jain Ambika, goddess Ambika, which is actually from the Deccan, which is Karnataka. But some of these Karnataka images also follow what I would say the majority Chola trend. Whether that means that there were some major sources in South India which were just available all over South India. So, I wasn't able to see within that period, I couldn't see like a clear separation between the copper source being used in the say Kannadiga region from the Tamil region. So it's as if to say it's more a chronological thing, that at particular periods there were certain sources of metal which were broadly available, if you know what I mean. But I think it needs much more access to metal and access to samples. And I'm afraid that those days there were some very enlightened curators and all, but I think now people have become even more concerned about, so it gets even more difficult now too. But I think really there's a lot of work for further research and, to be done and to be taken further. If we should talk about that, how to, move things.
Then you can proceed with the questions.
Yeah, next question is from Geeta Bhatmanaban. Chidambaram Nataraja, any studies on that?
Yeah. You mean analysis?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, as I said, with the temple collections, it's of course much more difficult to get access to samples and things like that. So a lot of what has been studied is really to do with the museum collections. And the other thing I should also say with the kind of technique, I mean, there have been some studies using, the portable X-ray analysis method. But then, X-ray analysis, where that is useful is in terms of, it is a bit of a surface analysis technique. So it can tell you the overall alloy maybe, but because of the fact that you're dealing with also the surface corrosion and everything. So it's not as it's not as accurate as doing it's a semi-quantitative technique, so it's not as accurate as doing the full qualitative analysis by using microsampling and also, unless we get the permission to do that, then to do it to that level of sensitivity is difficult. But I would say, I have a feeling that that very early Pallava bronze, which I attributed to the Pallava period, which was before that it was thought to be Chola, the one which is now in the British Museum, that could have been one of the images which was of the kind being worshipped in Chidambaram. So, one could speculate about where these images were earlier as well, because that being such an early image, I can't imagine where else it would have been, used in worship.
So the next question is from Guru Swami. He says, no, before 1,000 years back, how could they produce
Vijayan,
2,000?
he raised a hand, so he can ask directly, right?
Okay. Guru Swami, can you ask the question directly? You can unmute the mic and ask the question.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, madam. Hello?
Yeah, you can ask the question.
The question is, now we are using extremely high technologies for producing high temperature. But before 1,000 years back, how they achieved that extremely high temperature for smelting purpose? What's the technology behind it?
Yeah. So, so the smelting of copper now has been done not just in India, but across the world. And in fact, it starts in the Levant or the Anatolian region and then spreads to other parts of the world. So the pyrotechnology seems to have been, whether it's accidental or, deliberate, man has been able to figure out how to do it. Well, how they, in the sense that they had to have had, you see, unfortunately with and this is very true even today with, let's say, with the foundries and Swamimalai and so on, it's particularly in the Indian context, is that there is a lot of reuse of the furnace materials. And I mean, even today, if you were to see any of the foundries for metal casting and so on, they reuse absolutely everything. The molds are recycled. And so there's not much of, let's say, the remnants of the furnaces to study from an archaeological context. So it's difficult to make those correlations, and you probably need to do refiring experiments and so on. But this would have been about, for copper, it's about at the range of about 1200 degrees or so. But there's, maybe sometime if I give a talk on the woods tradition, which I'll talk about there we have been able to do a bit more on the reconstruction, and they were again able to reach very high temperatures of about, under highly reducing conditions, the temperatures can come down from 1300 to about 1200 degrees or so. And that was the temperature that they were using to do this, the production of the carburization of wrought iron to crucible steel and so on. So, and, a lot of it, we find a lot of those remnants of the crucibles, of course, which is highly vitrified and had a lot of quartz-rich materials, so it's highly refractory and so on. But the furnace, the remnants are more difficult to come by. So I think we need to do more on the archaeology and the archaeometallurgy, I guess, to do those reconstructions and things like that.
Oh, madam?
Yeah.
Can I ask one more question? Hello?
Go ahead.
Sir, what madam says is correct, but now we are using heating coils, resistance coils, etc. But in those days, there is no current and there is no LPG fuel, only firewood. But with the firewood, according to chemistry, you cannot go more than 200 degrees Celsius. Then how it was possible?
Yeah, so this is where I think you need to have more of experimental archaeology and so on to, explore some of these aspects. Because, I think they were able to prepare charcoal as well. That would have happened at some point. Because, as you say, with firewood, you have your limitations. And of course, for the heating of the molds, even these days, they use all of this mix of, coconut husk fuels and cow dung cakes. I think a lot more studies actually should be done on the surviving traditions and so on. And in fact, the copper smelting, you'll see the accounts are there from Rajasthan, the Khetri region and so on, which are still there. So, there are, of course, these were recorded more by the British travelers and such like. So that's another, very important aspect of archaeology is what we call the experimental archaeology, which tries to look at how, they might have arrived at all this and so on.
So next question, can I go to next question? It's the question from Aparna. What technique is used to plot elemental dot matrix, geoinformatics?
So elemental dot matrix, yeah, that is actually, no, you see, when you use electron probe microscopy or a scanning electron microscopy, in using the electron probe, the wavelength dispersive electron probe microscopy, you can actually, it picks up the concentration of every element. The raster picks up, as you go along the, you first have to prepare, I don't know how much microscopy you'll be familiar with. You have to take, let's say, a cross section, then you have to polish it so that you get the actual metallic structure being, shown up. Then you have to put some conductor material, and then you put it into your scanning electron or electron probe micro, your wavelength dispersive spectrometer. And so what that does is that picks up the concentration as a raster moves on at every point of different elements, and that's how it builds up. So it's a visual representation of that, the concentration along that particular cross section of different elements from the, the wavelength dispersive spectrum and so on. And of course, there are other techniques also, the backscattered electron microscopy and such like, to pick up the different phases and things like that. So I think that way, EPMA and all that has been very important and useful as tools for studying ancient metallurgy. So I think I've answered a lot of questions for more than a half an hour. We might have to save it for another time, or how are we doing?
Yeah, we have only a couple of questions. Let us finish it off. Okay.
Yeah.
If we have time. Well, the next question is there any studies on Kalabara period, which is called the Dark Ages?
Well, that's what was quite interesting from some of my analyses, which the so-called Kalabra, but of course, it's also a question of, that's why I loosely call it early historic and Andhra Pallava or whatever, because as I said, there was that small yakshi, which from all of this dating and all that, I mean, the metallurgical profiling, which can be used as a term, maybe preferable to dating, metallurgical profiling, as I might call it, that, as I said, fitted what I would think of as a Sangamera and so on. And then, you had that zinc ingot and that Andhra Pallava Avalokiteshvara and that other votive octagonal vase, which was definitely early historic, probably Andhra. So that is that sort of period, I would say, 4th, 5th century. Of course, what we call as Kalabra is still, I mean, there's even historically, it's being recognized that there was, you see, with the mining evidence and all that, there's a likelihood that there's a lot more of, these kinds of gaps, which can be filled in from the technical side, which may not be that, evident in terms of the remnants of the art historical evidence. Because one thing, of course, is that metal can be melted, remelted and recycled, and that's happening even today. We're losing a lot of heritage because when you go to a lot of the, the scrap merchants and so on, they're just, surviving solely by recycling. So because they're so-called a dark age, because there are not many finds and so on, doesn't mean that there were not artifacts, because we can't say what has been remelted. And I think you do have some copper plates and so on, which are filling up this gap and so on. So I think there's, it's a case of further work would throw more light, I think.
So next question from Sakti Sweta. How they find out the period of icons that belongs to particular century?
I think I talked about this quite a lot in my talk. Sorry, would you repeat it?
How do they find out the period of icons that belongs to this particular century?
How does who find? Because it depends on who you're talking about. Are you talking about the art historians or the archaeometallurgists? Or
no. The question I'm just read from Sakti Sweta. Can you clarify your question?
Yeah, I couldn't understand what is the question exactly.
Can you clarify your question, Sakti Sweta? You can unmute your mic and ask the question directly. Okay, let me move to the next.
Ma'am?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi.
Ma'am?
Go ahead.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Ma'am? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can see.
Yes, ma'am. My query is how the researchers are found that these idols are particular to this 11th century to this 9th century. Is there these are all findings from the evidence from the poets or like that? How they find that, ma'am? Exactly that this belongs to this 9th century, 11th century. How is that, ma'am? The researchers are like that, ma'am.
Yeah, so if you heard my talk, I was trying to point out exactly this, that there are different ways that they approach it. One is that sometimes you look at the stylistic studies of the temples, and then you can compare it to the stone sculpture, which may be based on, which will have some inscriptional evidence. Or you have to look for the inscription evidence on the piece and so on, or the similarities to the sculpture and so on. And then what I was talking about this entire talk was how you provide some added methods by which you can try and understand this process better of dating the artifacts, yeah? Which is where the scientific methods also come into to play. But basically, I mean, at different periods, as I was pointing out as I was going along, certain patrons, you know, they liked a certain way of depicting an image, and so more images were made in that particular style. So there are some connections there with the royal patronage and the styles and so on. I think if you get into the subject more, you'll understand how that's.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah, this is the last question, I think. How you find out the percentage mix of elements in a sculpture?
So basically, if you do an analysis, you know, like inductively coupled plasma, optical emission spectroscopy, you can analyze, it depends on the analytical technique you're using really. So there's no one answer, it really depends on what analysis you're doing. So you need to really look at what is the capability of the analytical technique you have. For instance, some analysis techniques like atomic absorption spectroscopy, it's what we call a single element analytical technique. So you'll have to measure for each element. Say if you want to know the percentage of copper, so you have to know beforehand which elements you're looking for and then, you know, measure for each of them. So the particular technique that I used called inductively coupled plasma optical emission spectroscopy, the advantage is that when you take the filings or whatever and you make it go into solution, and then the plasma can simultaneously analyze, in this case, for 18 elements. You get the analysis for all of those. So you have to get into this whole aspect of how you analyze from using technical methods. It's the same thing as, you know, you would use any standard, say, even if you make a copper alloy in your lab and then you try and analyze it, how would you set about analyzing it? First, you try and look at the microstructure, maybe, which tells you about the phases. And then, so you have to start from, you know, as you say, start from one step to another. And then if you have access to an SEM, then that throws up different ways of analyzing as well, and different kinds of information, like studying about the matrix map. So it really depends on A, what you're looking for, B, what sort of equipment you have in hand and what you can get out of that equipment. And then you can proceed to.
Hello, ma'am?
Yeah, it's Bharat, go ahead.
Ma'am, you spoke about oak steel, ma'am. Is there any books related to it, or is it from India? What is it, ma'am? Actually, oak steel.
Why don't you read some of my publications? If you go to my website on NIAS, you'll be able to get them. But I also have a book on the India's legendary wood steel. Yeah.
Okay, ma'am.
Have a look at that and give you
Yeah.
some. And if I'm next giving a talk on woods, which may well happen, I'll pass on the link to Dr. Govindarajan because it's a vast subject. I can't start another lecture now.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
I think we can close it, and some questions are coming up. Okay, I think we can encourage only one question. Do we need more study and research on astronomical evidences?
Yes, again, that is an area of, because I mean, in the past, all pre-modern civilizations, they had a lot of time in their hands, so they would have been doing a lot of, looking at the skies, and perhaps a lot of the, the rituals and so on, since it was a more fatalistic kind of way of looking at, life. Maybe they felt it was tied to the, ways in which the celestial observances and so on. So yeah, and especially in the Indian context, of course, there is a long tradition of these kind of observations of and connections, especially in the temples. You have, of course, the grahanas and all the rest of it, but also even I think the ways in which maybe the architectural elements sometimes, for instance, even with megaliths, there's been a lot of documentation that the megaliths were, going back to Stonehenge, but even in India and so on, that they were taking advantage of the solstices and things like that. So I think there's a whole body of research here also to be looked at in terms of how, apart from the textual aspect, even the actual evidence of how, the observances of how the observances of solstices and various other phenomena were being, incorporated into the architectural elements and so on. I think all of this is big field future as well.
We can close the
Yes.
session.
Yes.
It's the time to close the session. It's a formal thanks from PSL. I think no one is available for doing the thanks. No. So on behalf of PSL, I would like to thank Dr. Sharda Srinivasan for her wonderful lecture. She spent almost 2 hours with us and she patiently answered all the questions. Thank you very much, ma'am. And I also thank all the participants. I thank Dr. TRG to introduce the speaker, and Dr. Seduraman introduced about the Tamil Nadu Science Forum. Thank you all.
Thank you. And in fact, I probably didn't add in that last question, but the crab supernova was probably also observed by one of the indigenous communities where they made 2 suns and things like that. So, as I said, apart from the text.
Do you have a reference?
Yes.
Oh, that would be nice.
No, this was somewhere in, I think in North America or somewhere. They made 2 suns, in one of the rock art. So anyway, I think these kinds of aspects are always very interesting. But thank you so much for inviting me, and it was a pleasure and very good discussion and questions, and Romba Nandri, and all the best to everybody.
It's indeed our pleasure.
Thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't fulfill the mission to speak in Tamil because I speak private.